This is that ripple effect that I was talking about, as far as like when we see kids who have challenging behavior early on in development. So even during toddlerhood, beyond just your toddler type behavior, where children are really learning to use challenging behavior for communication, and that just gets reinforced and reinforced. Then they go to school, right, preschool, and we still see those challenging behaviors at home and or at school. We see this ripple effect where all of a sudden families are feeling discouraged, potentially what I talked about yesterday about that pessimistic viewpoint about their child, or just feeling like kind of down and out on themselves too. We also see families that will isolate themselves, stop going to family functions, stop going out to eat at restaurants, not being invited to birthday parties. We also see that peer rejection, even, the subtle, I don't want to play in that center because he's playing there or she's playing there. And then we also can see some inconsistencies in educating kids, or kids get left out of academic activities because of their behaviors. So basically, this is a trajectory, unfortunately. And these little ones get this name of he's the one with challenging behavior, or she's the one with challenging behavior, and that carries on. And we see it carrying on throughout school sometimes. So I'm sure some of you have heard like that third grade kind of threshold. What we find is that early intervention is so much more effective, especially with addressing challenging behavior at those earlier ages. Kids tend to get removed from classrooms as they get older, and school gets harder. And so when school gets harder and you're missing out on educational experiences, then we see that gap. So this is it's just a nice visual, and it's based on Carolyn Weber Stratton's research. She is the creator of Incredible Years. So, okay, I just want to make sure I followed up with that one. All right, any questions so far? All right, we are going to dive into the behavior rating scale and the data collection system for PTR YC. I know some of you, if not all, have just received behavior incident report training, which is fantastic. That is a great tool to use as we're investigating potential, or not potential, investigating problem behavior, right? We're trying to find a pattern. You can use that data for baseline, to justify going to PTR YC after trying a couple of targeted strategies to help support a child. I know the question came up yesterday, like how long do you do that type of investigative work before you go to PTR YC? And that looks very individualized based on the team and the child. But I was able to talk to Lisa a little bit afterwards, and I think there's this threshold of do we wait too long or do we go too quick, right? And the happy medium would be lovely, but it's not always that clear. So my suggestion is, based on what your structure is in your flow chart, I was able to see Yale's flow chart, which is really great, is this idea of don't wait too long, because then we're going to miss our mark and we're going to reinforce that gap, right? That ripple effect. And we don't want to do that. We want to make sure kids learn new behaviors, alternative behaviors, before it gets harder and harder for that to happen in their educational experience. Does that make sense? So let me just, and I don't want to confuse anybody about like the BIR versus the BRS. One, they're both amazing tools. Two, the BRS is just used in particularly for PTR YC behavior support plan. The reason being is we are taking data on positive behavior as well as negative behavior or inappropriate behavior. What we do is base that off of the operational definition that you created. So this is one of the things I like as a practitioner with PTR YC is that your work that you did at the goal setting meeting, it carries over to this meeting. Like, oh, this is why we created an operational definition. We're going to use it for our data collection. So what you do at this meeting is, as a team, you decide how you're going to measure both the positive behavior and the inappropriate behavior. So measurements could include frequency. So we often use frequency when we see aggression, usually like hitting or biting, pushing, because that's something that happens quickly. It's easy to measure. It's not always easy, but it's easier to measure that one occurrence, right? So say it's center time, and through your BR or BIR data, you've been able to collect on average, say 10 incidences where the child is hitting, right? And of course that might look different based on how you're collecting your BIR data, right? You might not be doing one for every single one incident, but through the observations that you've collected, you can say fairly confidently as a team, yes, at least 10 incidences happen. That's our baseline for this child during center time, right? So that helps you develop what we call anchor scores. And I'll talk about those anchor scores in a moment. But I just want you to know like that rationale of using both the BIR and the BRS. The other measure that we can use is duration, right? So tantrums, kids that have prolonged crying. And, you know, sometimes we see kids cry for 45 minutes. Sometimes we've seen kids cry from the beginning to the end. How many of you have taken the teapot training, right? And we see little Charlie, and he cries for a very, prolonged incidences, right? So we would figure out from there, what would our baseline be? And that would be our top number when we create our anchor scores. Intensity is really hard to measure, but sometimes, and I've worked with some teams that have used intensity based on child aggression, usually. So I've had a team measure intensity by a hit being just a little tap to a hit being the child is knocked down on the ground. So that's level of intensity. Percentage of time would be, for instance, say it's circle time, right? Our scenario with little Joey going or not going to circle time, we might measure that percentage of time that he appropriately sits based on our operational definition at circle time or attend circle time, right? So it would be 100%, 75, 50%, 25%, or 0%, right? And then percentage of opportunities, that may be, many of you may be familiar with the friendship skills, and we do a lot of like passing things out, like passing out props or greetings to friends. You might do percentage of opportunity. Out of all those opportunities to greet your friends, how successful was I? Did I greet 100% of the friends or just 50% of the friends? So that's, those are the ways that we measure, behaviors. So let's just go right here, and we'll go over some of those anchor scores. This is usually the trickiest part, to be honest with you. during that behavior rating scale. And it takes a little bit of time. Again, my suggestion would be definitely use those case studies as examples to look at and see how they created their anchor scores. But here you see the appropriate behavior is engagement, and the problem behavior is does not respond. So looking at this team's anchor scores, we can see that the appropriate behavior of engagement, they're rating this based on hierarchy of prompting. So we tend to use a least to most hierarchy of prompting, meaning like we give the child time and room to respond appropriately versus jumping right in. That would be a most to least prompting. And most to least prompting we use for teaching a new skill. So this would be something that we would want to provide some level of support for the child to be successful, right? I think sometimes when we take behavior data and we're looking at the alternative behavior, it's almost through osmosis, we're hoping the child's just going to learn the new skill. We actually have to teach them and create supports for them to be successful in learning their alternative behavior, such as engagement. So you can see here that what we would want, right, is independence, and that would be a 5. So this might be something you might even want to physically just write down, or if you have a BRS or behavior rating scale in front of you, you might just write it down. That 5 is good for appropriate behavior. We want 5s. As we go to a 4, that's providing more prompting. As we go to a 3, that might be sometimes a partial physical prompt, or in this case, it's a physical prompt. 2 is the child doesn't look or respond. And 1, the team decided, is a walk away. The child just walks away. Okay, so 1s are not desirable for appropriate behavior. We want 5s for appropriate behavior. The reason why I'm stating this like this is because it's flip-flopped with the inappropriate behavior. 5s are not so great. We want 1s. And the reason why it was done this way, a couple slides from now, I'm going to show you a graph. We will be able to see a trend much more visually by the appropriate behavior going up and the inappropriate behavior going down through the graph, which is really cool. And what's cool about that is that daily you can see progress or you can see regression. Where some programs where you're plugging information in, that might not happen until the end of the week, or you might be sending it to a data collector, so you might not be seeing the graphs right away. This you're seeing daily. And that's what we expect for a behavior support plan, that there's daily data collection and daily analysis, because we need to make sure we're on the right track. Okay, so with the inappropriate behavior here, they use percentage of time. So my guess this was during circle time, right? Or during a large group activity. So the child does not, 5 in this case is the child does not respond at all. And then they're doing knots. Of course, we're pyramid people, we usually say what they are doing, but in this case, with the negative, we're saying the child doesn't respond 75% of the time, the child doesn't respond 50% of the time, the child doesn't 25% of the time. So it's really these increments, right? Balanced increments. So it's easier for us to perceptually see where the child's at. So when I say perception, this means we don't expect you to have a timer. We don't expect you to have a clicker. I worked with a child whose baseline was 309 hits to the head in a 3-hour period of time. And I used to carry a clicker. I was primed to see this little boy hit his head, right? Where if I used a perceptional tool, I might not have been so like focused in on just that inappropriate behavior. But I can see in a short period of time, say it was arrival time, if I could do a time sample of how often he hit his head, I might get 20, right? And then perceptually, I can tell the difference between 20 versus 5. Does that make sense? The reason why this tool is designed this way is because we want to honor teachers' sanity. Because when you're taking very precise data, that can get really grueling. And sometimes we get in a, we don't get accurate data. Sometimes we miss data days. Sometimes, right? It just feels too much. It's too much of a chore. Where this type of tool, we have gotten really great responses where teachers take accurate data, more accurate data, and on a timely basis. So this is what Jackson's team decided to use for his data collection. They are using frequency for both, and you can use the same dimension for taking data for appropriate behavior and inappropriate behavior. So their baseline was 9. So within center time, his baseline was 9 times or more. So that's where they started with their anchor score, and then they reduced that as they went on. Does that make sense? Right? So you would do your 5, and then you figure out your 1. Notice that they have 1 to 2 times for possible aggression, right? Oftentimes I see 0, like that last one we saw, 0 or 1 time, because developmentally kids may hit one another from time to time. If we're going from a 9 to a 1, that's progress, right? Then eventually, obviously, we want the extinction of that behavior, but we need to boost up his skills. And then there could be a phase 2. And in Jackson's case, he did have a phase 1 and a phase 2 to his plan. I'm going to show you this right now, and this will give you an idea of, clearly this has been put on Excel. This was just based, oh goodness, this was because our research, everything was put into Excel. But if you imagine paper pencil and that BIR data tool that you have, this is what it looks like somewhat, where the red is the challenging behavior and the blue is the appropriate behavior. And you'll see the trend, the data trend for challenging behavior is going down, and for the desired behavior, it's going up. This black line here means when the intervention started. Okay. And when we look at, not to get too behaviorally analytical here, but when we look at behavior data, we really like clean, lovely behavior data is this beautiful upward trend for positive and this lovely downward trend for negative behavior. What we see is some variation, right? What would that tell the team when we see variation? And this is 10 days.
So maybe something else is going on those tough days, like he missed breakfast, he didn't sleep well the night before.
Awesome. Thank you, Cindy. Yeah, right. Hey, what's going on during these days? You know, if you notice at school, wow, nothing's really changed here at school. Maybe we want to check in with home and see if there's been any changes, which is fantastic, right, to do, because oftentimes we may hear, oh yeah, you know, he didn't sleep because it was a full moon and then this occurred, and I had to work late one day, and he had to go to grandma's and then, right? What are some other things? And this is a good discussion. It's okay to not know too and be like, just give your best shot, give your best guess.
So there's a chat
What?
from Shanika from HRA. The intervention might not be implemented with fidelity.
Lovely, fantastic. Thank you so much. And that's very insightful. And that is one of the first things we'll look at, right? In addition to checking in with home, like Cindy was saying, is that are we implementing the plan as intended? And to be quite honest with you, what tends to happen when we implement behavior support plans and they start working, we see teachers start reducing the implementation of the intervention because they're like, it's working. Now we don't have to do this, right? Oh, it's all better now. But no, we want to keep that going, and potentially we need to keep those supports in place for that child to be successful. And clearly, of course, we would start fading back, whether they're reinforcements or this or that, but we don't want to stop using the plan until we make a team decision on like, all right, we're in this generalization mode now. Let's start fading back systematically. But that's one of the biggest mistakes, is that we stop implementing the plan, or we stop reinforcing as often as we said we were going to do. So perfect. Thank you so much. It was very insightful. And as I say this, we're not even at the plan yet. We're not even there. So what can tend to happen when we start taking this data is a couple of cool things. One, we have teachers really start thinking about, oh, wow, what can this plan look like? Another thing is, since we're taking behavior or positive behavior data too, we tend to see, and I think it was Chris that mentioned it yesterday, wow, the kid, he's doing it. He's doing those skills. We just haven't noticed because we've been looking at the challenging behavior so much. And we just need to give more reinforcement for the appropriate behavior. So that can happen too during this time. All right, so we are supposed to move on to the other topic, but I'd like to give you guys a little time in your breakout rooms to decompress this new tool. And there is a little on the Google Drive, and I can broadcast the link and or the hard copy document. I think I can do that. And there's a little scramble. It's like to unscramble the anchor scores to put them in an appropriate order. 5 is being what we want for appropriate behavior, and 1 is what we want for inappropriate behavior. So any takeaways that you want to share, ahas that came up, or feedback that you would like to share or work through as a group?
We found that when we were creating our own, the top and the bottom were pretty easy, and finding the steps in the middle were a little bit harder.
Yes, good. It takes some practice. I would recommend looking at the case studies that are in the book and also the examples that are in the PowerPoint, and not to say that it has to look the same, right? You get as accurate, or you get as balanced as possible with, at least if you're taking frequency data or duration data with timing. So you do your best there, but again, it's a perceptual tool. So the difference between a 1 and a 2 isn't all that huge, but like a 1 and a 4 is, right? So that's how we're going to see a trend, either going up or down. I will be, I can share with you that one of my groups that I'm working with in Tennessee they had to have a meeting this week to talk about, is everyone on the same page with the operational definition due to the data? It was interesting because the teachers are reporting out that the child's behaviors are going away, but their data doesn't suggest that. Their data is kind of all over the place. And so it's more of, one, how the anchor scores are written. I think as simple as you can be is beneficial. So try not to make things too complicated, and making sure that everyone understands the operational definition and understands what those anchor scores are. For instance, if you're going to use hierarchy of prompting, that everyone understands how to do hierarchy of prompting. One of their anchor scores was prompting, and the prompting, I think, isn't well defined, and I think that's what's creating some variation in their data collection. So that also is, excuse me, I'm gonna sneeze. That also is a checkpoint that you would want to check in with, is make sure that sometimes we use the word calibrated, that we calibrate the data collection. So you as a coach might come in and take data alongside the teacher too, so you guys can accurately say, yes, we got the same score here, or really close to the same score. Does that make sense? And that's going to be part of when we're creating the behavior plan, what needs to be in place to make that behavior plan a success. So training in data collection, training in implementing particular strategies. Okay.
Johanna, I just wanted to thank Betsy Perry. She's doing the training with us, and she is the one that put the flow chart together and graciously shared it with all of our teams, and now with NCPMI. So thank you, Betsy. And
thank you, Lisa.
Rose is also on the call today from the team. So just wanted to give a shout out to Betsy and Rose and their team.
It was a very collaborative effort, so can't take all the credit at all.
Well, that's the way it's best done, right? Collaboratively. We all have so many different perspectives of what needs to happen first. So, but it's a wonderful tool, and thank you for sharing with NCPMI too. Okay, everybody, we are diving into functional behavior assessment. Now we need to figure out what is the function of the behavior. So we're going to use a variety of different things to figure out that function. We're going to incorporate the data collection that we're collecting, but now through the functional behavior assessment, and we use 3 checklists, part of PTR YC. And this is chapter 5 in your manuals, which starts at page 59. We're going to collect as much information as we can to figure out function. Some teams, as I mentioned yesterday, will have a very clear vision of what the function of the behavior is. And some teams won't have a good idea based on just the maybe inconsistency of the behavior itself. Sometimes children have a dual function, and that also can make things a little complicated, but not impossible. But it's good to know if there's a dual function, meaning that they're exhibiting challenging behavior to get something and to get away from something. Okay, so that's going to determine a few things. One, what we're going to teach, and how we're going to respond to that challenging behavior. So right now, we're just still in the inquisitive mode and trying to gather as much information as possible. All right, and then we have some cute little cartoons in here, meaning it's all fun and games until someone figures out the function of your behavior. Then we know what to do, right? So remember yesterday when we were talking about the 5 universal practices, there is a checklist in your manual that goes over those 5 universal practices and that is on page 62. As I mentioned, this is probably going to look a little different in the revision. We'll make sure that you guys get updates on when that happens. But yesterday I reviewed it because it might be something to start with. You know, when a teacher says, hey, I've been taking BIR data for a month now, and we've been trying to integrate some strategies to help support this child, but we're still seeing challenging behavior. This might be a great tool to whip out and have the team fill out together collaboratively. And sometimes this is a tough one because we're talking about some universal strategies that we're hoping are in place already, but they may not be, right? And that's okay, without judgment. You know, maybe we're shy on that 5-to-1 and it's more of like a 2-to-1. Or maybe we're really not reviewing those behavior expectations as often as we should and reinforcing those. So anyway, this is a great tool to do as a precursor because this is going to make a difference in how we write the plan. And you'll see in a moment, we actually incorporate these 5 universal practices in the behavior support plan. So we also have what's called a classroom profile for challenging behavior. And that is still in still in chapter 5, but on page 60. And these are types of things that are happening in the classroom that are perhaps we can, as adults, modify the environment or increase some of our universal practices in supporting all kids. This is a profile for all children, not just that one child. For instance, there's one indicator that says, are there more than 2 children experiencing challenging behavior in your classroom? Right. Another one is, does challenging behavior occur across most or all classroom routines? Are more than 2 or 3 children experiencing challenging behavior? Have you reduced the time allotted for large group activities because of challenging behavior? So these are kind of checkpoints. Like if you have 2 or more yeses here, we know that we can probably do some classroom management coaching or skill development to help support that teacher. Now, another variable may be the ratio of children who are experiencing challenging behavior or who have, say, an IEP versus children who are quote unquote typically developed, right? So if we have a discrepancy in that ratio, then someone said, and I'm so sorry that I don't remember who said it in the chat yesterday, but children model behavior. If we don't have enough strong peer models, then we're going to see more challenging behavior. So this is a validation for high quality inclusion support too. Okay, so this is what that tool looks like. And for Jackson, the teacher documented that there were 2 or 3 or more children experiencing challenging behavior in the classroom. This particular teacher needed to work on 3 of those universal practices. She and the team decided that they really needed to work on those routines within routines within routines, teaching those behavior expectations, and implementing more pro-social, peer-related skills, teaching opportunities for the children universally. So that now, those 3 will be incorporated into the plan as universal practices. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Okay, so basically with a functional behavior assessment, we're going to look at what the triggers are or what the antecedents are. And that is our first checklist, which is titled Prevent. And then we look at our Teach, which is like, what are some skills that the child needs to learn or benefit from learning? and then what are the reinforced, or what are the responses that we usually have when the behavior occurs? Because that's usually what's maintaining the behavior or reinforcing the behavior to occur. We also, within that checklist, each one of those, we're looking at what potentially is affecting or promoting the inappropriate behavior. And where it gets a little confusing is there's not a defined line that says, now we're talking about what are possible teach strategies that we might be using. I would predict that in the revision, there'll be a more defined line. So just so you all know, it takes a little bit of time to get used to this tool, but I find it's very helpful too in getting the information that we want. So here's an example of Jackson's prevent strategies, or prevent functional behavior assessment. Let me pause and say that one, these are on your CD-ROM, if you have capability of doing CD-ROM action. I also put the forms on the Google Drive, but also they're in your manual. This is filled out in a couple of different ways. One of the ways that I found most successful is when you have your functional behavior assessment meeting, that you're all filling it out together and one form is being filled out. I've done that by projecting it via LCD projector, or everyone has it in front of them and one person's documenting it. I would suggest sending this to everyone first for them to look at so they become familiar with it, but not with the expectation that they have to have it filled out. Because that could be overwhelming to a family, it could be overwhelming to a teacher. So just being really cognizant of that. Also, they might need some guidance in filling out the tool as well. So that would be my suggestion. During the research study, we also did it where everyone fills it out and then everyone gives it to the facilitator and then the facilitator summarizes it. I just feel like you miss, and we all agreed, you miss a lot of conversation. You miss a lot of there's sometimes a misunderstanding. Sometimes what can happen is, even though we've defined one target behavior, we have the teachers using the laundry list of the behaviors. So the FBA is skewed because they're thinking about all sorts of different behaviors, not just the target behavior. Does that make sense? In one case, in the beginning of the project, we actually had to do the FBA over because it became very apparent that the teaching team were thinking of all the behaviors that were going on at that time. Okay, so this is Jackson's, and you can see that what they were showing, at least in what we can see here, is that are there specific activities when challenging behavior are more likely to occur? And the team decided that social interactions, center time, or transitions, especially leaving and entering the class, were the hardest for Jackson. And then so on and so forth, right? So are there specific circumstances that are associated with the high likelihood of challenging behavior? So they had a pretty good list here, right? I mean, sometimes I see teaching teams just filling out all of them. Yep, that one. Yep, that one. That one. That one. And that's okay. I mean, especially if it's for real. But reprimands, being told no, sitting near a specific peer, right? Sometimes kids have a peer that they are triggered by, getting someone's attention, playing with others, transitions, end of preferred activity, unstructured time. So this is going to help us know how to come up with prevention strategies to support Jackson. Okay. All right, and here are some more here as far as, does the challenging behavior seem to be exhibited in order to gain attention from peers? And they said yes. So as a team, we might start thinking about what are some of these skills that Jackson needs? What would be one of those skills? Appropriately gaining attention from peers, right? Instead of putting your hands around their neck, you might want to tap them on the shoulder and say, do you want to play with me? So this is a checklist here of possible teaching skills to teach Jackson. We wouldn't teach a child all of these skills all at one time, right? Clearly not. But we might come up with a sequence, right? Or a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 even. And that's what Jackson's team decided to do. Okay, so these are the teach checklists. And of course, it's not everything on there, but it's some of the checklist items for Jackson. And problem solving, you can see that problem solving was a really tough time for Jackson. And these are some of the skills that he can learn in order to reduce the likelihood of the challenging behavior. So this validates that the teaching team probably has to do a lot more universal instruction around pro-social behavior, right? Because there's quite a bit of items there. Also, communication. Did we hear Jackson talk very much in that video? We didn't, right? And so the team was thinking maybe we could ask him, or we could teach him to ask for a break, or to ask for help, or to express his emotions. So certainly having some sort of functional communication. And that was something that was brought up yesterday that we can talk more about when we're looking at that behavior support plan intervention, is functional communication. When kids don't have functional communication, they will have challenging behavior. Okay, so this is reinforce. Okay, one of the questions that we ask is the child's challenging behavior addressed? You know, is the likelihood of the challenging behavior addressed? Meaning, like, do you respond to the child's challenging behavior? And that is like never, seldom, sometimes, and always. And this teaching team said always, right? And then it says, when does the child get attention for appropriately behaving? How often does a child get attention for appropriately behaving? And it's the same thing, like never, seldom, sometimes, always. And usually we see the always for the challenging behavior and the never or seldom for the appropriate behavior. And that, to me, as a facilitator, that is usually the, oh my gosh, we totally just focus on the challenging behavior. And that's when we usually see a change in everything when we're doing PTR YC. We see a really, like, a lot of reduction in data on the behavior data, the challenging behavior, and an increase in the positive, because teachers, I think, realize, like, we need to flip this. Anyway, that's my, that is my experience and what we've learned from the data trends. So here are some of the common responses to challenging behavior. And for Jackson, he was sent to a quiet space. He was given a personal space, or a verbal redirection, removed from the activity, physical prompt, or peer rejection. So I'm just gonna state this, and you're gonna learn more about Jackson, but if we're dealing with a child who wants to interact with his peers, right, but he's not being able to successfully do it, are we helping him here by his reaction, by these reactions? Not really, right? That verbal redirection may help get him back rolling, but he's being removed from the situation, which in a way can make us think, well, I wonder if he's doing this for escape behavior, right? Because this is our response. Maybe he's trying to get out of social situations. So we would want to do a little bit more work, investigative work around that. So what items or activities are enjoyable for the child? So when we think about response, right, or reinforcement, we need to think about how are we going to reward the child when they're actually using that new behavior that we're teaching them. And that response, and we'll talk about it after our break, it has to be more powerful than what has been happening. They need to know that this is what works versus the same old, right? So this is where we get individualized too for kids with behavior support plans and potentially intensive, right? So they get reinforced every time they're using that new skill at first, and then we eventually fade back once the child starts learning it. But these reinforcements might be really powerful. So that's something as a team you have to think about, what is it? I've worked with kids that were reinforced with playing with tape. You know, sometimes it's like something totally out of the box thinking, and that's where families can really help us too with some of those reinforcers. So once you collect all this information, we put it into a summary form. And that's usually the role of the facilitator, meaning like you take those checklists and you take what's most important and what stuck out, and you write down what are those things that we know is a variable for the inappropriate behavior. So many of you may be used to an ABC data sheet, right? So antecedent, what the behavior is, what the consequence is, what's the response to the challenging behavior. That's essentially this, but it's more in a general form. Then on the bottom, we consider, well, what are those prevention strategies that might work for Jackson? What are some of those things that he likes? What are those things that work well for him based on the functional behavior assessment? What are those things that we might want to teach him, like seeking attention or pro-social behaviors? And then what are some of those reinforcers? So for Jackson, he really likes an iPad. He likes listening to stories. He likes feeling special. So these are potentials, right, that we're writing down. What's nice about this form is that this summarizes those 3 checklists. So you don't have to always take out those 3 checklists. You just have this concise form here. And with that information, you create what's called a hypothesis. And that is the cornerstone of a functional behavior assessment. This is our best guess in why the child's exhibiting this behavior. Okay, and you'll see right down here at the bottom of your functional behavior assessment summary form is your template for your hypothesis. So we're going to zoom through this. You can see what Jackson's team used as a summary. For you all to know, you have this on the Google Drive and or in the hard copy. I sent Lisa's the hard copies of this too. So you have his summary in the Jackson vignette folder or file. So this is a more concise representation of what is possibly what we're seeing in the classroom, what is possibly the function of the behavior. And based on what the team has collected, they're predicting that we have a dual function here, right? So based on him trying to get his friend's attention and also based on the response to that challenging behavior, they're stating based on the data that he may be having an escape behavior from those either non-structured time or those social opportunities too. Okay. And then here are the desired behaviors, what may work for prevention strategies, what may work for teach strategies, and what are possible reinforcers. Here is the best guess, the hypothesis template. When, in quotations, something in the environment occurs, then what the behavior is that we're seeing, say we're looking at aggressive behavior. As a result, and then in quotations, is the typical consequence that reinforces the behavior.
So that if anybody wants more on functional behavior assessments, you can go on the OEC pyramid pages. There's 3 pages of pyramid model information on the Office of Early Childhood website. Go on that and there's videos that walk you through how to do a functional behavior assessment. And there are also webinars on how to collect data and BIRS, and also a webinar on PTR YC using that. So you can check that out there and take it away, Johanna.
Okay. This functional behavior assessment process and the data collection process, it's not everyone's favorite thing to do. It's kind of dry, although some of us really like this type of stuff. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but what this does allow is more access to kids to get a behavior support plan intervention in a more, in a quicker way, versus some of our systems take so long to get these interventions in place. And so that's the rationale for trying to make this as easy as possible, and just know that there's a carrot at the end of this, right? There's hope and promise for the child to make gains. So this is what Jackson's team came up with our hypothesis, and perhaps it's close to the one that you guys came up with. But when Jackson is in a non-structured social play, and they were even descriptive as saying center time or outside play, then he will engage in aggressive behavior or in physical aggression. And they said, see the operational definition. And I think that's important to make sure that you're still at this point checking in to make sure that the operational definition is the same, or if it needs to change, it can. As a result, he will gain attention from adults and peers and receive an object from peers and/or receive an object from peers and/or escape from the activity being sent to a quiet space. Okay, so simple as that. We don't need to complicate it any more than we have to. So once you identify using this menu, and I'm gonna role play, because that's being a preschool teacher, it's kind of in my nature to role play. I will get a blank summary form so you can see what I'm talking about. Hold on, bear with me one moment. Thanks. Okay, so I have a blank summary form. Actually, I'm just going to use one of the case studies that we have right here. I'm going to use Ethan's case study. Okay, so this is what the summary form looks like. And you'll see under prevent, right, it says brief description. What the team did, they just entered one of the prevent strategies that are listed in the intervention menu. And that is use visual supports and schedules. So that's what they're doing. When they're brainstorming, they're thinking, ooh, yeah, Ethan's really could utilize an individualized schedule, or we can use some more visual supports for him. So they write that down. And then they may brainstorm, what would that look like, right? So underneath they have implementation notes. What would it look like? So before that routine occurs, we're going to offer him these types of supports. And they list out what that looks like as a team. Then they're going to look at teach, and they enter one or more. So it could be more than one one of the teach strategies from the intervention menu. Okay, and they decided to use peer-related social skills. Then they add a description of how they're going to use peer-related social skills in their teach model. And then lastly, they enter a reinforced strategy based on the intervention menu. And then they list out what they're going to do or how they're going to implement. So this is just a brief description in implementation notes. It doesn't necessarily replace the plan. You might have to provide more of a task analysis, and or what we develop is a fidelity checklist on how to implement this strategy. But as you can see, this is a fairly simple form in creating your outline for your intervention plan. I'm going to show you this document on the big screen too. Let me get to it really fast right here, okay? Look at what else is on the top of that summary form. It's those 5 universal practices. So for Jackson's team, they have 3 checked off. They have teach those peer-related social skills. They have teaching behavior expectations and the routines within routines within routines that they have to work on globally in addition to what they're doing with Jackson. Does that make sense? It cues them in. This also helps you as a coach if you're playing the role of coach in the classroom. One of the projects that I'm working on, which is really unique, is we're working with pyramid model coaches and behavioral specialists. Currently, all the behavioral specialists I'm working with are BCBAs, and they work together based on any of those prevention universal strategies with the coaching, classroom coaching goals. So they're infused into their ongoing coaching goals and action plans. So that is one thing that we will want to make sure is in place as well.
And everybody's able to see all those case examples, right? I just want to make sure that no one has questions. Starting on 119, there's a bunch of different examples, and you can see the chart that Johanna just put up filled out for each of the children. Please stop us if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, for sure. What we know about this training is you can never ask an inappropriate question. All questions are valid. And even a year from now, you can ask questions because there may be some. So that's the gist of creating, I'll go back to the slide again, creating the intervention plan by what the information that you collected from your FBA, right? You take that summary, and now you're working as a team. You've met, this is the 4th time you're meeting. So you're starting to get a clearer vision of what you want to implement based on the function of the behavior, based on the hypothesis. You plug in those intervention menu strategies, then you start brainstorming how you're going to implement. It may take a little while to start implementing the plan, right? Sometimes you have to get materials in place. Sometimes you need to get procedures or training down. We would want to make sure, the pyramid way, that there's an action plan associated with this behavior plan to get whatever we need to get in place. Materials created, materials laminated, materials cut out, training, those types of things. In addition, and I'll share it now, not we, but the authors, my colleagues, they decided not to put in a template for writing your plan. They did that with rationale. One, many school districts use a different form for behavior support plans. Not that all of our students who have a behavior support plan are on an IEP, but if they are, we want to make sure that it's that it fits with whatever document that the school district requires. So you will see in your case studies for every chapter and every meeting, there's a case study example. There's 4 of them, that they're written slightly different. You will also see that those plans are only 1 or 2 pages long. Back in the day, I remember like 17, 20-page behavior support plan documents, where this is only a 1 or 2-page document. So much easier to digest. Okay. Any questions about that? All right. This is when we talk about reinforcement. So we have to be very, very intentional and sometimes creative about the reinforcements that we use. And a reinforcement schedule is used to make sure that we are responding to the child's new behavior in a way to create this higher likelihood for that behavior to continue. Therefore, we need to have a lot of consistency and sometimes a higher dosage of reinforcement. Have you ever worked with a child whose reinforcement changes on a regular basis? Like what worked today doesn't work tomorrow. In that regard, and you may have come across it already. If you haven't, I could just add it to the Google Drive and send it to Lisa to pass on to everybody. But we have a reinforcement checklist, an inventory checklist, which is really helpful to have family fill out, have teachers filling out, have anybody that's related to that child either working or spend time. Like my daughter spends a lot of time with her grandma, so she would be an appropriate person to fill out that inventory, to come up with what are some of those things that that child likes. Is it music? Is it, like I said, the piece of tape or a piece of lint? Is it being the helper of the day or being the helper for that activity? What are those things that's gonna, keep that child going? What we do with reinforcers too, and I realize I'm not necessarily using those PowerPoints and reading them verbatim. But what we want to do is make sure that there's a high value behind it, right? Ideally, it's natural. So I can share with you a little bit about Jackson. They did integrate the iPad. They only had to use it once. Because what they learned is that what Jackson really wanted was to interact with his friends. And when he started learning these new techniques on interacting with friends, that was the reinforcement schedule, because the friends then responded to his appropriate behavior. So that's the ideal, right? That's like the gorgeous, beautiful reinforcement schedule that we want. Using things like intentional teaching or incidental teaching. When we know a child wants something, they present the behavior that we're looking for, and then they get that. Is lovely too, right? There are times when we need to use a more, that would be intrinsic. We need to use more external reinforcers. So sometimes that takes a lot of creativity, and it sometimes is out of our comfort zone, right? When you have to use something like an iPad, or in some cases, if you have to use food. I'll share just a little bit, when I was working strictly in schools designed for kids with autism back in New Jersey, every kid got a little snack box. It was like you got enrolled in the program and here you go, here's your snack box. which was really strange, right? And now in retrospect, I'm like, wow, I can't believe we've done that. I would say since I've been in Colorado for 20 years, very rarely, if not ever, have I seen a reinforcement of food in a child's behavior plan, but it may happen due to that is what is going to motivate that child. With that said, if we use anything external like that, we want to have a fading procedure. We don't live there, right? Because that's not the real world. We need to make sure that we are integrating that naturalistic reinforcement too. That's why we always pair, and I'm sure you're used to hearing this, positive descriptive praise. And when we say positive descriptive praise, we're stating what the child has done, and then we give an enthusiastic emotional comment after, depending upon the child. Have you ever worked with a child who cannot stand positive reinforcement? I have, so then you don't use it. You use something else, right? You use a thumbs up, you use a wink, letting them know socially that you approve of their behavior, that they're rocking and rolling, paired with whatever reinforcement you might be giving them. For instance, I can see Chris, or I saw Chris, he just left, but I can see, like, say I'm reinforcing Chris, and I say, Chris, you are using your walking feet right on. And I'm giving him the reinforcement. First, I'm telling him what he did well, then I'm giving him his reinforcement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, can I add?
Yeah, please, Chris.
So I turned off my video because I was going to type in the chat, but one of the things, I had a child who couldn't handle that praise, or they felt singled out or embarrassed, right? Even though it was a positive thing. And so what we ended up doing was, it was like a 3-step, like, secret handshake kind of thing, where if he did something good, I would look over to him and give him a thumbs up, or it was like the fist bump was the first step, and then he would finish the next 3 steps. And we didn't have to say a word, but he knew that that meant, you're on track, you're doing what you need to do. And then he would go kind of complete what he was doing or finish. So it was cool to see that.
Excellent. Yeah. And here's a wonderful crowd right here. And to be quite honest with you, sometimes when you're working with kids that have aversion to positive specific praise or any positive attention, use your resources, use your colleagues, say, hey, I've got this situation going on. What are some things that you've used, right? We've used some visual cues of reinforcement or gesture cues, but somehow we need to create some sort of way that the child knows that they're doing the right thing. Plus, I love Chris's example. We also want to have a shared enjoyment with the child. And in most cases, not all, in most, the reason why we see that particular behavior is because this has been not a positive experience for that child in their history. So we need to kind of give them some positive interactions instead of what they may have experienced in the past. As when the light shined on me, it's usually not for a good thing, it's for something else. So, or it could just be a temperament, right? Our developmentalists, temperament has a lot to do with how we respond to children. Any other comments or thoughts about reinforcement? Okay, this is one area, remember when we were talking about discrepancy or variation in data, that we would look at. We look and evaluate, is the reinforcement strong enough? And oftentimes what we may hear from a team is, oh, I forgot. I've been forgetting to reinforce them. And we need to make sure you're reinforcing and that there's some sort of schedule in place for reinforcing kids. There are some times, especially for duration behaviors, that you need to reinforce like every 10 seconds.
It's
So-
another example too of how important it is to include the families because they can give you a lot of input about reinforcements. And I always, whenever we talk about this, I think of adults too. Some adults don't like a lot of positive attention given to them, you know, and it's just like children. We're also different on what is a reinforcer for us.
Absolutely. I'm going to give another example too. It's just a common thing that may happen is this idea. Let's look at a large group activity and we give a child a fidget, right? Or we give a child a reinforcer that's hard to give up. So say I have this during my circle time and I'm not necessarily using the best behavior, right? I might be using my inappropriate behavior. What do you do now? Right? So we have to be mindful of what type of behavior we're using, or I mean, what type of reinforcement we're using. This one's a tricky one because, you know, you got to get into a schedule of, okay, you could have it for maybe 30 seconds and then you have to give it back. And if that's going to be too hard for the child, this might be a tough reinforcer, right? Especially during a non-preferred activity. So just be mindful, right? Like, are we making the situation worse? Or are we really reinforcing the child for their appropriate behavior? The other thing is that you want to reinforce immediately after you see the behavior. Sometimes what we do is a little prolonged, and what can happen is an inappropriate behavior happens before we give them the reinforcer. And that's a bummer too, because you're like, darn it. Either we don't reinforce the child for the behavior that they did originally, or we do reinforce them. And then we're just inadvertently reinforcing the inappropriate behavior. Does that make sense? So this is a big area where we want to provide a lot of coaching and problem solving and working through. So here we go. Preparing to implement. Number one, let's evaluate what areas do we need to do some training around and coaching. That might look like we're watching a webinar or we're watching a 5-minute video model of how to implement a particular intervention plan. Who will do this? Right? We need to make sure that's documented with a timeline. When is this going to get done? How often will the implementation plan be implemented, right? So if there's circle time every day and that's their area of focus, well, it's going to happen every day during circle time. When will the plan be implemented and when will the data be reviewed? So how long will the team commit to implement the plan before determining if it's working or not? And that was one of the questions that you guys had yesterday around that, tier 2 types of support. So generally speaking, we will set up a meeting 2 weeks after the plan has been written and in place, ideally. But usually we're always meeting 2 weeks after that BIP plan. So the BIP, the behavior intervention plan. In some cases, it may be a week after, depending upon the child's behavior. So when we're looking at really serious, dangerous behavior, like eloping from a building or throwing furniture or, putting hands on kids' throats, those types of things, we want to have more check-ins. But generally speaking, within 8 to 10 days, we should be seeing a behavior trend going in one direction or the other. Any questions about that? I'm going to show you a couple of tools, and I don't want you to get overwhelmed by it. They're all very similar, meaning like you can use them all. Like you could just choose one and stick with it, and you would be covering yourself. But basically what we have created is like a whole picture of what PTR-YC looks like from beginning to end and what forms you use for each meeting. Okay, so I'm going to show you 2 specific resources that you have at your fingertips. So this is a document that we created through NCPMI, which is just a 1-pager. So this is sometimes really nice when introducing this topic to a teaching team or to a family. We actually have one for families too. That's a little bit more parent friendly. But you can see that we have step 1, meeting 1, team meeting and team meeting goal setting, and what forms you use, and then what your goals are for that meeting. Okay, and then so on and so forth. So teaming, data collection, FBA, then the intervention plan development, and then follow-up, which happens 1 to 2 weeks after. One of the things that I did and I do when I facilitate these meetings is I pre-schedule each one of these meetings beforehand, usually at that team meeting, because we're all together. We could all get our calendars out. Now, there's no perfect science behind this, because sometimes we have to adjust and adapt, but it's nice to have these meetings like within a week, right? So teaming, then the next week is data collection, the next week is FBA, the next week is creating a plan. That's how we were able to write plans within a month. Okay, so that's this form that we will send to you discreetly. I'm going to stop sharing and then show you the other document, which is a literal checklist. Those of you that like checklists, like myself, this might be the tool that you would rather use. So we, my colleagues and I created this as we were doing the research. So it, very similar, right? But you literally have a little box that you can check off if you would like. So it's the whole picture here, all the meetings. And then how would you include parents per each meeting or step? And this was the basis of the development of those NCPMI documents. Okay, so this is what Jackson's team came up with for his intervention plan for a summary. So you can see that for prevention, they used actually 2 of the intervention strategies. They used providing choices and altering the classroom environment. So when you see the post video in a moment, I want you to take note of what are some of the changes that you notice in the environment. As far as his teach strategies, they use that peer-related social skills primarily. 1, setting up a buddy system within the classroom, which really helps. There's the rationale behind that is that we expose children to others. So equally, children learn how to play with one another, because sometimes naturally that doesn't happen. So that was one of the techniques that they used, as well as embedding and practicing learning opportunities throughout the day. And then lastly, they reinforced his desired behavior. And they also implemented, this is very ABA language, but a differential reinforcement for desired behavior, desirable behavior that is independent and unprompted. So that usually entails either like a token economy system or an interval system. Within like 5 minutes, if we see the child independently using these skills, they get reinforced. So it's more of it's a sophisticated system in reinforcement. And so if those of you are experienced with using that, that's a great tool to use. So then, as you can see underneath those strategies are their notes that they took. Now, we couldn't just leave the plan as this is, right? This isn't enough information. We need more information for the teachers to know how to implement. So going back to what I talked about yesterday around that managing complex change, if we don't have all of those, you know, the vision, the skills, the resources, the action plan, the incentive, it's hard to make a plan work. So we need to make sure that the teachers know what they're supposed to do. Because if they don't know what they're supposed to do, they're not going to do it. It's just like kids. So some of you may be used to hearing us talk about clear beginning, middle, and end, or those 4 questions. What am I supposed to do? How do I know I'm making progress? When do I know when I'm done? And what do I do next? And so this adheres to this behavior plan. So we want to be as descriptive as possible when we write that out. Okay, so here are our next steps and how we kind of move forward in all of this. I'm gonna go fairly quickly. I'll step out of my Colorado voice and go into my Jersey voice, and we'll go a little quicker. Okay, so we're gonna identify when progress will be reviewed. My advice is review often, right? As an internal team, that data should be collected at least 1 time a day. So say it's circle time, it's just after circle time, you just take your data, done with the data for the day. And you want to review that fairly often, right? You're looking at it and we see the natural trends there. But as a team, like I said, a week or every other week, we want to make sure we're checking in. Analyze the behavior trend, right? Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it like this? When we see this, we know things aren't necessarily being consistent, or those reinforcers aren't strong enough, and or there may be something going on at home that we need more information, or something going on in the classroom. There is a really cool tool similar to those checklists that I just sent to you on page 140 and 141, and that's that implementation guide. It basically is your summary of all the work that you did. So in my experience, I like to fill that out as I go, because it's just okay, this is what we decided to focus on. This is what the data that we're collecting. This is the FBA. We went over the FBA. This is our hypothesis. So it's just a nice, concise summary of your whole plan. And then we use fidelity checklists. So as part of the study, this is what we use to measure implementation, fidelity of implementation. So as a coach and a facilitator, I would go in on a regular basis and I would do my fidelity checks. These are also great tools for the teacher to use to see, oh, am I doing all these steps? So super handy. With all these included, generally speaking, we get a lot of success from this. What we learned is that function-based interventions never work at 50% fidelity or even 75% fidelity. We need 100% fidelity in order for it to work. We never want to throw out a plan until we know that we've implemented this plan as intended. So I'm going to show you our fidelity checklist. We asked 3 guiding questions within that fidelity checklist. Were all the steps implemented as intended? Did the child respond as we thought they would? Sometimes they don't, right? And therefore we might want to change that one part. And then was the strategy frequently implemented as intended? Meaning, was it daily? Was it maybe 3 times a day that we wanted to implement it? So on that column that we see prevention strategies and the steps, teach strategies and the steps, and reinforce and the steps there. You might need more steps, right? You might need additional space for that. So that's something to consider. Please know that with the revision, it's going to be a little more user friendly. But this is generally like a task analysis. First we do this, then we do this, then we do this. For instance, it might be first we read the social story before we transition to circle time. We review the rule card. Then we transition to, transition cue to circle, provide a choice of where the child wants to sit, right? Those are the steps that we would have in place.
Johanna,
Yes.
we had a question. How does the child's response correlate to fidelity?
Good question, right? I think this is more of an evaluatory, if I'm saying that correctly. We're evaluating whether the child's responding the way we thought they would respond. For instance, we're thinking choices may be a good idea to use for this particular child transitioning to a place to sit for circle time. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe this is not the strategy that's working for this child. Maybe they do better knowing where they're going to sit versus having to make a choice. Does that make sense? So that it's just more of a data point, I think. So very good question, because you're right. It's not necessarily a fidelity measure there. It's more of, did the child respond the way we thought they would? Is that helpful?
Yeah, and Meg said, if the high interest is not so high interest.
Meaning like the,
Oh,
yeah.
so I guess sometimes we make assumptions when we're picking the reinforcer. So if we're thinking something is really a high interest, but then when you get to implementing it and the kid's like, meh,
Yeah.
I don't know whether that's a fidelity issue or you just go back to the decision making and you pick a different reinforcer. I have an example. One of my kids did one of the Yale child study things as a little boy, and the study assumed that kids didn't like broccoli, and he loved broccoli. And the first 10 minutes of being there, he ate the broccoli that was part of the study, and they had to reorganize the whole thing. It was very funny. So I don't know whether that's fidelity or you just change it.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a fidelity measure there, like you said. I think it's more of a checkpoint, like, oh, yeah, it's more like when you go back to your data point or like reviewing these fidelity checklists and you're like, okay, we're implementing the plan as designed, but the child's not responding necessarily to these the way we thought they would. Therefore, we may not be seeing a positive behavior trend, if that makes sense. So very, very intuitive. Thank you for bringing that up. Any other questions around fidelity checklists? They're amazing. They're amazing tools. We should have, I've started doing it with coaching too. So breaking down checklists for teachers when they create protocols for how they want to teach or how do they want to respond to certain, normal classroom problem behavior. So they're really handy. Okay, so here is Jackson's fidelity checklist based on his prevention strategies. So you can see that they were a little bit more descriptive on what providing choices looked like for him. And then also that classroom arrangement. So they decided to limit the number of toys at the centers to promote the use of peer-mediated social skills. And then his teach strategies, so more detailed than what we saw in the summary, right? So teachers using that peer-related social skills, using a buddy system used at center. So peers are assigned to a play group for playing at centers. That's the first thing. And then peers and Jackson play together at 3 center rotations, previously determined length of time. So very descript. So those are things that we want to make sure are happening on a daily basis. And then also teacher classroom adult facilitates practice opportunities of these peer-related social skills. So Jackson's learning to get attention, peer gets Jackson's attention, Jackson shares with the peer, peer shares with Jackson. So based on, this is just integrating some training, based on research, we know that if we get 4 exchanges, we have a higher likelihood of developing a friendship with somebody. And so that's why we're always shooting for 4. If we could get 4 exchanges, at least that's great. Okay, now look at the response, right? A little bit more detailed, where we have procedures for responding or reinforcing that desirable behavior. Jackson's prompted or unprompted use of peer-related social skills is reinforced immediately with praise, verbal high fives. After 3 successful rotations, Jackson earns iPad for last 5 minutes of centers. So remember me saying they only had to do that once. He didn't want to play with the iPad after, because he was starting to have reciprocal interactions with peers. I mean, that's pretty awesome. He chose to stick with his peers than go and play with the iPad. That differential reinforcement, is it helpful for me to read these? Okay, I don't want to bore you to death, but sometimes it's like helpful to hear it because it's so small. But that differential reinforcement for appropriate behavior, independent use of the replacement behavior, that peer-related social skills, seeking attention, sharing, turn taking, are reinforced or followed with extra praise and acknowledgement. Remember, he likes to feel special, this little guy. So giving him, you could see some stuff like maybe super friend and those types of things would be helpful for him. So then ignore, they decided to do an ignoring procedure for the challenging behavior, right? And we saw some pretty aggressive behavior. So intervene with redirection, prompting for use of peer-related social skills upon demonstration of precursors for challenging behavior. Precursors, you're probably all familiar with, like anticipating that a behavior may happen based on a sound that the child's making, based on one behavior that might be kind of mild. We know when that happens, this big behavior is going to occur. So the teaching team decided to use some of these precursor behaviors, such as like wandering or flitting, how he was flitting his little objects around, as a precursor. Oh, we need to prompt him to get back engaged. If the challenging behavior occurs, adults use minimal language and prompts to engage in a new activity. So get him re-engaged, not focusing specifically on the behavior. And then once no demonstration of aggression is observed, adults prompt Jackson to return to the center or with peer interaction, and supports him to re-engage in play activity. So he's not escaping from that play activity. They're waiting until he's de-escalated to re-enter, but he's not coming back. Does that make sense? If he doesn't come back, then he's getting reinforced for that escape behavior. But if we bring him back and help support him, then he's not getting reinforced for that escape behavior. And then reinforce that re-engagement. See how that's really clear? So if we just say ignore challenging behavior, what can happen sometimes? In this instance, like this is what the team decided to use for his ignoring procedure. But how could that be interpreted differently? to others. Like complete ignore, right? Like no redirect, no regulation support, just complete ignoring, which sometimes is the case. Sometimes we do that, planned ignoring. But you need to be very, very careful of that procedure and be on board.
Yeah, I would think some would think that could be neglect at some point if you're not paying attention or not good supervision, if they don't understand what's going on.
Yeah, for sure. So, the teapot, right? So that's why in the teapot, that's really important to know if they have a planned ignoring procedure in place, because sometimes it does look like that. And there's, I could go down a rabbit hole in teaching you that whole concept. There's a lot of validity behind planned ignoring, but everyone needs to be on the same page, and you have to be fairly, really accurate, really, with the function of the behavior. Anyway, with any of this type of procedures, we can expect an extinction burst, which I mentioned yesterday. And that usually is the child's in their mind saying, hey, why isn't this working like it used to? But ideally, we have that alternative replacement behavior in place that we're teaching and reinforcing. When we don't have that in place, we see an explosion in challenging behavior. So it's critical that you don't just do the planned ignoring, that you have to be teaching and implementing a reinforcement schedule for that appropriate behavior. So a lot of times I've worked with teachers and they'll say, yeah, we try to ignore it, but it didn't go away. And I would ask, well, did you teach them a new way to get their needs met? Oh, no, we didn't. Well, it will never work that way. They'll keep on doing what used to work. Okay. All right, so that's the fidelity checklist. This is a bit of review, these slides here, because you guys were so intuitive as far as how do you know it's working or not, right? We always want to take data. That's on our teapot too, right? When we talk about challenging behavior, we want to take data in the beginning during that functional behavior assessment and data in the end. We don't stop taking that data. So if we notice that the behaviors are not going away after 2 or 3 weeks, or we're not seeing a reduction, we need to do some things. If we do see progress, keep on doing what you're doing. Don't stop. Don't fade too quickly, as I mentioned before. Work together as a team. If you start fading and then you notice that the behavior is starting to escalate again, go right back to the full-on plan without any fading procedures in place. Okay. If we're seeing variation, I'm sorry, we're talking about fading here. We fade 2 different components in a behavior plan. We fade the supports for that appropriate behavior, and we also can fade reinforcement. Does that make sense? So once we get multiple days of success, right? So 4s or 5s of positive behavior, 1s and 2s of negative behavior, we may, as a team, decide to start fading our supports and or fading our reinforcement schedule. So instead of it immediately being reinforced for the appropriate behavior, we might wait a little bit, or we may do an intermittent reinforcement schedule. I will explain that really quickly. Intermittent reinforcement schedule is actually one way to really, really strengthen a behavior. And I will give you a real life adult behavior that use intermittent reinforcement, and that's gambling. It's one of the most addictive behaviors that we have in our adult society. And that is because you're not always reinforced every time. You never know when you're going to get reinforced, but sometimes when you get reinforced, it's really big. So you're going to try it again, and you're going to try it again. And then, ooh, then you get another reinforcer. So in order to strengthen a behavior, if you want to strengthen a behavior, that's one way of doing it. But first we want to get that momentum, right? We want to make sure the child knows that this is where we want them to go with their new skill. Does that make sense? So that might be something that you decide as a team, ooh, I think we're ready to either do it intermittent or just slowly reduce that fading or that reinforcement, especially if we're using tangible items like food or little trinkets or stuff like that. Okay. Also here, and you're going to see the BRS or the behavior rating scale as an example here. I mentioned to you guys hierarchy of prompting. Hierarchy of prompting, when we use that procedure correctly, is a really easy way to systematically fade your prompts, right? I know that full physical is the most intrusive or most explicit prompting schedule I can have. But I also know that partial physical prompt is a little less. And I then know that a gesture or model is even less than that, right? And then I know that just using an SD, again, I'm getting very behavioral here, just giving the child that cue of what we're looking for that behavior alone without prompting is the least. Does that make sense? So when we don't have a procedure like that in place, it's really hard to know, how are we fading? What does this fading look like? Where this is really clear. So with that said, and with our time, I want you to communicate with Deb and Lisa. If you need more information around hierarchy of prompting, let us know, because it could be a new skill for you all. And it's a great skill to have in using that procedure. Okay. So when things aren't going so good, I think we're really doing well in figuring out what to do, right? We've already heard some really great ideas from all of you. Checking in, right? Are we following the plan as intended? Are we using appropriate reinforcers? Do we need to do, and that's something I'll send to you, Lisa, is that reinforcement inventory. Sometimes we're off on our hypothesis. And sometimes during this time, it's a little more clear when we see the child responding to the behavior intervention plan. And we may have gotten it wrong. And honestly, that happens sometimes, and it's okay. And so at that point, you go back to looking at your FBA, and you may do another FBA to write a plan that is more appropriate for that function of behavior. I would say that's not a common occurrence, but it can happen, and it's okay, and not to feel like you all failed, because again, this is just a hypothesis. And sometimes it may be helpful to enlist additional expertise. One thing I didn't mention in the beginning of the training, and I should have, is this idea that we know that there's some limitations to PTR-YC. I'll explain. One, sometimes children have medical conditions that we just can't alter behaviorally, right? If a child has, say, asthma, and they have inhaler treatments or have to take medicine that may alter their behavior, that's out of our control. However, we wouldn't necessarily say, don't do a behavior support plan for that child. we would just want to make sure that we are very in tune to that child's, communication between home and school, whether the child had a nebulizer treatment that night before, what those setting events may be to help promote success for that child. The other thing that we can't neglect is trauma, right? We can't control what has happened to children or what is happening to children, though there are hopefully additional resources available for families and children to support them. But through a behavior support plan, we're really shaping a behavior of a child and a teaching team. So we would want to make sure that those additional supports are available for that child. We would still, you could still use a behavior support plan though. Okay, you just need, ideally you understand what those child's triggers are if you can, if you're dealing with, say, post-traumatic stress disorder, and being very sensitive to those needs. And again, this may be another time when we need to call for external expertise. Okay, so just know that we're not saying this is it. This is it. You just do this and all behaviors will go away. That's not necessarily the case. But through this system, we can individualize to support children and teams. All right, so this was Jackson's fidelity data. They kind of knocked it out of the park. They were at 90% 1 week, and then they were at 100% the additional weeks. So clearly, we're going to see some really cool stuff in this video. Well, I think it's pretty cool. So let's watch. I want you, you're now familiar with what the plan is, right? Pro-social skills and environmental change. All right, so enjoy your movie. This is not going to be your Friday night movie, I promise, but your Friday afternoon.
How about you can go and be the register?
Okay, we'll take your time, honey. Do you want some more pineapple? That was a good suggestion. You want pineapple?
I don't want pineapple.
Okay, you don't have to eat it there, baby.
Why did we wait and put them in the
It's in the cash register.
Oh, Mommy, when I go get it, it's scary.
You go with Gianna into the
It's a credit card.
and Cannon.
So what's the big experiment? Okay, sir. Come out. Go out. Go out, guys. This one. Okay, the parents. I would like a hard one. Let's be the parents. Okay, give it to me, sir. Let me see what it is. This is mine. Even I want a horse. You can't steal. Okay. Where is Sissy? It's not. This one's $90. Okay, I got this. I got this one. Oh my God! $90. Yeah, Max. This one's $40. Jason!
All right, Jason, are you having a hard time, buddy?
Okay, I'll pay that. Stop. You want to take my card out? This is $40. I want these. I want these hats. Those ones I want. Okay, but the white one's not paid. I'm sorry, it's hanged up. Okay. That means it's not paid, so put it back where it was. Okay. But you can buy this one. Did you guys see this? Okay, Alex. This one.
Okay, so what were some of your thoughts and reflections?
The girl in pink could get a W9.
Totally, right? She's got her rolled down. Like, I'd like to hire her. Yeah, that was good. Any other observations?
Only the 3 children stayed in the area. There wasn't children coming in and out, and there was more space than last time.
Way more space, right? Way more space. And you're right. Yeah, it was, they were adhering, they were following the rules to, and the teachers were too, to the center check-in. And that was helping with some of that wandering. Even to the extent, remember that was kind of open, the center area, the dramatic play. So you could really easily come in and out of dramatic play, where that was set up where you were like checking in, you were going to the store. And what kind of store was it? It was a hat store, right? Clearly, no mistake. It wasn't a kitchen, it wasn't a, you know, baby nursery. It was a hat store that they were at. Did you guys notice what they were wearing? Little necklaces. Those necklaces are rolls. So they were saying they're customers, and she clearly was the clerk, right? She was the cashier. What's cool about that is you could really mix and vary the roles, right? There could be a stock person, especially if there's kids that have strengths around categorizing. They could categorize where the hats go. So we could really infuse and individualize for kids. What else did you notice?
He was following the children's directions. She told him to put it back, and he did, without complaining, he just went back and tried to hang it up.
Lovely. Power of peers, right? Without, and you know, $90, right? Reporting back to, whoa, this is an expensive hat. What about Jackson? Did we hear a lot of verbalization before? No.
That's what Shanika just put in the chat. He was speaking a lot more than before.
Yeah, that's right. Did he look more comfortable? Yeah, and those interactions that he was having with peers, were they thumbs up, or were they like what we were seeing before? Right, way more thumbs up. So what happens to he and his peers is that, oh, Jackson's cool. I love hanging out with Jackson. He's fun. We play hat, the hat shop and this and that. The other way, what we were seeing, probably kids reporting, hey, so Jackson did this again. Oh, I don't like playing with Jackson. He hurts me. Right? So this is the trajectory of Jackson's future is improving by providing supports.
I think that's like what's so motivating about this is that when we put the plan in place and it's working, the child gets so many more interactions and they're so much happier and they're getting reinforced intrinsically. And then they keep building on those skills. So they're getting more and more social emotional skills. Whereas when they have challenging behavior, they're having less and less opportunities to learn those skills. And that stays with them through life. It just keeps compounding every year. So if we can help them and support them at this age, it's going to improve their whole life.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that said, you kind of prompted in my mind, sometimes we hear, well, you know, the family doesn't follow through at home, so what's the point, right? There is a point, and actually we have data showing that this helps. Even these exposures within preschool and these relationship development with peers and with other caregivers, this is critical. This is critical to lifelong quality of life, is that if the more connections that we have, this makes a big difference in children. So this is a huge deal to continue doing this work and making sure we're consistent. That's what this slide is about. We want to be as consistent as we can, and that's not always easy. Sometimes it takes some time. We also need to remember to celebrate every step of the way. One thing that I really try to do, especially with programs that are doing program-wide implementation or, you know, some sort of teaming going on, if someone's doing a behavior support plan in their classroom, maybe spread some love their way, because this is not easy stuff, and there is a silver lining. But it's a lot of work at first. So maybe share some love and celebrate and check in and see how things are going. And then we can do some questions. And I'm gonna stop sharing for a bit so we can just talk a little.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, that was great.